For Russia to secure a stable future, it will need to address its political and economic challenges. This includes diversifying its economy, implementing political reforms, and finding a way to coexist with the West and other global powers. The future of Russia depends on whether it can evolve from its authoritarian past and adapt to the changing geopolitical and economic realities of the 21st century.
The roots of the Soviet Union can be traced to the early 20th century, marked by the rise of revolutionary ideas within Russia. Discontent with the Tsarist autocracy had been growing for decades. In 1917, the Russian Revolution erupted, leading to the overthrow of Tsar Nicholas II. The Bolshevik Party, led by Vladimir Lenin, seized power in October 1917, promising peace, land, and bread to the working class and peasants. The Bolshevik Revolution was the first successful socialist revolution in history. After the revolution, Russia plunged into a brutal civil war between the Bolsheviks, Reds, and the anti-Bolshevik factions, Whites. The war lasted from 1917 until 1922, with the Reds eventually emerging victorious. The conflict devastated the country and led to widespread famine and suffering, but it solidified Bolshevik rule and paved the way for the formation of the Soviet Union in 1922. Vladimir Lenin played a pivotal role in shaping the new Soviet state. He introduced the new economic policy, NEP, which allowed some degree of private enterprise and market freedom to revive the economy after the destruction of the Civil War. However, Lenin's health deteriorated, and in 1924 he died, leaving a power vacuum that eventually led to a struggle for leadership within the Communist Party. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin emerged as the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rise to power was marked by political maneuvering and the defeat of rival factions within the Communist Party. By the late 1920s, Stalin had consolidated power, becoming the supreme leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin's rule was marked by brutal repression. The Great Purge of the late 1930s saw the execution, imprisonment, and exile of millions of perceived political enemies. Key figures in the Communist Party, the military and intellectual circles were targeted, contributing to a climate of fear and paranoia. In the 1920s and 1930s, Stalin launched a series of ambitious economic policies aimed at rapidly industrializing the Soviet Union. The most significant of these was the forced collectivization of agriculture. Peasants were compelled to join collective farms, and resistance was brutally suppressed. The policies led to famine and millions of deaths, but did succeed in transforming the Soviet economy. When Germany invaded the Soviet Union in 1941, Stalin's leadership was tested in the most severe way. The Soviet Union suffered enormous losses, but the Red Army eventually repelled the Kiev, with the Battle of Stalingrad turning the tide in favor of the Allies. The Soviet Union's victory in the war came at a horrific cost, with millions of soldiers and civilians perishing. After World War II, tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States began to rise, leading to the Cold War. The ideological divide between capitalism, led by the United States, and socialism, led by the Soviet Union, resulted in decades of political and military confrontation. Both sides engaged in proxy wars, nuclear arms races, and ideological propaganda. After Stalin's death in 1953, Nikita Khrushchev became the leader of the Soviet Union. Khrushchev introduced significant reforms, including de-Stalinization, which involved dismantling the cult of personality surrounding Stalin and releasing millions of political prisoners. Khrushchev also aimed to improve the Soviet economy and initiated a series of agricultural reforms, though with limited success. One of the most dangerous moments of the Cold War was the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union secretly deployed nuclear missiles in Cuba, leading to a standoff with the United States. After tense negotiations, the crisis was averted, but it marked a high point of Cold War tensions. Leonid Brezhnev succeeded Khrushchev in 1964, ushering in a period of stability and stagnation in Soviet politics and economics. The Brezhnev era saw a strengthening of the Soviet military and the consolidation of Soviet power in Eastern Europe. However, the economy began to stagnate, and corruption became more widespread. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan to support the communist government there against a growing insurgency. The war became a quagmire for the Soviets, drawing parallels with the U.S. experience in Vietnam. The Soviet withdrawal in 1989 marked a significant failure for the USSR. Mikhail Gorbachev became the Soviet leader in 1985 and introduced a series of reforms aimed at addressing the Soviet Union's economic and political crises. His policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, sought to democratize the Soviet system and revitalize the economy. However, these reforms also exposed the weaknesses of the system and led to growing dissatisfaction. The collapse of the Berlin Wall in 1989 symbolized the end of Soviet dominance in Eastern Europe. Gorbachev's decision not to intervene militarily in Eastern Europe allowed communist governments to fall, and a wave of democratization swept across the region. In 1991, a combination of economic problems, political unrest, and nationalist movements in various Soviet republics led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. The failed coup attempt by hardline communists in August 1991 accelerated the process. On December 25, 1991, Gorbachev resigned, and the Soviet Union officially dissolved, giving way to 15 independent republics. The collapse of the Soviet Union had profound effects on world politics. The end of the Cold War marked the emergence of the United States as the world's sole superpower. In Russia, the post-Soviet era was marked by economic hardship, political instability, and the rise of oligarchs. In the aftermath of the Soviet Union's collapse, Russia, as the largest successor state, faced challenges in redefining its identity and place in the world. Boris Yeltsin became the first president of Russia, and the country struggled with economic transitions and the legacy of the Soviet system. Vladimir Putin rose to power in 2000, consolidating control over Russia and restoring some elements of Soviet-era authority. Putin's Russia has been marked by growing authoritarianism, the reassertion of Russian power on the world stage, and economic stability driven by oil and gas exports. Many former Soviet republics, such as Ukraine, Georgia, and the Baltic states, have struggled with the legacies of Soviet rule. Some have pursued closer ties with the West, while others have experienced political instability and conflict. The breakup of the Soviet Union remains a defining event in modern geopolitics. The Soviet Union's impact on world history is immense. It shaped the global order for much of the 20th century and left a complex legacy in terms of politics, economics, and culture. Despite its collapse, its legacy continues to influence global politics, particularly in Russia and former Soviet states. After the Soviet Union's collapse in 1991, Russia faced significant economic challenges. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a market-oriented economy was chaotic and painful. The privatization of state-owned enterprises led to the rise of oligarchs, a small group of wealthy individuals who accumulated vast wealth during the transition period. Hyperinflation and a steep decline in living standards further exacerbated the situation, leading to widespread poverty and social. The 1990s saw the rapid privatization of industries that were once under state control. A small group of individuals, later known as oligarchs, acquired large portions of these industries, particularly in oil, gas, and natural resources. These oligarchs wielded significant power and influence, often manipulating the privatization process to their benefit. Their dominance in Russia's political and economic landscape played a crucial role in the country's post-Soviet trajectory. Vladimir Putin became president of Russia in 2000, succeeding Boris Yeltsin. Putin's rise to power marked a shift toward more centralized authority and a return to stronger state control over the economy. Under Putin, Russia saw a period of economic growth, largely fueled by rising oil prices. This economic boom allowed the Russian government to rebuild its foreign reserves and begin investing in infrastructure and social services. Putin's leadership focused on reasserting Russia's power on the global stage. He sought to strengthen Russia's influence in former Soviet republics and establish a more assertive foreign policy. Russia's intervention in conflicts such as the 2008 war with Georgia and the annexation of Crimea in 2014 exemplified Putin's willingness to challenge Western powers and reinstate Russia as a dominant force in global geopolitics. Russia's economy has remained heavily dependent on energy exports, particularly oil and natural gas. As one of the world's largest energy producers, Russia's wealth and political power have been closely tied to the global energy market. The volatility of oil prices, however, remains a significant risk to Russia's economic stability, as seen in the 2008 global financial crisis and in recent years amid fluctuating energy demands. Under Putin, Russia has seen a rise in nationalism, with a focus on protecting Russian sovereignty and opposing foreign influence. Political dissent has been suppressed, and independent media outlets have been increasingly restricted or shut down. The government's control over the media and its crackdown on political opposition have led many to describe Russia as an authoritarian state. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea, a region that was part of Ukraine. This move was condemned by the international community and led to the imposition of economic sanctions against Russia. The annexation marked a significant escalation in tensions between Russia and the West, and the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine has remained a point of contention ever since. Following the annexation of Crimea, pro-Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine declared independence, leading to a violent conflict. Russia has been accused of supporting the separatists with weapons and troops, although the government has denied direct involvement. The war in Donbass continues to be a major point of conflict between Russia, Ukraine, and the international community. In 2015, Russia intervened in the Syrian civil war, providing military support to the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Russia's involvement was a strategic move to secure its interests in the Middle East, including its military base in Syria. The intervention allowed Assad to regain control over much of the country, but it also drew Russia into direct confrontation with Western powers and further isolated Russia internationally. Under Putin, political opposition has been increasingly marginalized. High-profile opposition figures, such as Alexei Navalny, have been imprisoned or poisoned, and the Russian government has used laws to silence critics. The government's clampdown on protests, media outlets, and independent organizations has drawn widespread criticism from human rights groups and foreign governments. Russia's relationship with the West has become increasingly hostile since the annexation of Crimea and its intervention in Ukraine. Economic sanctions, diplomatic expulsions, and trade restrictions have strained relations with the European Union and the United States. Russia's actions in Syria and its alleged interference in foreign elections have further soured its relations with Western nations. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine. The conflict has resulted in widespread destruction and massive civilian casualties, drawing condemnation from countries around the world. The war has led to further sanctions on Russia and has significantly reshaped global geopolitics. The war has also put a strain on Russia's economy, which is facing increasing isolation. The Soviet Union's collapse left deep scars on Russia and its former republics. The Soviet system left behind a legacy of economic mismanagement, corruption, and political repression that still affects the post-Soviet states. The transition from Soviet rule to independent nations has been difficult, with many struggling with the challenges of democratization, economic reform, and national identity. The expansion of NATO, particularly in Eastern Europe and the former Soviet republics, has been a significant point of tension between Russia and the West. Russia views NATO's eastward expansion as a threat to its sphere of influence and has been vocal in opposing the inclusion of former Soviet states such as Ukraine and Georgia in the alliance. Russia's economy faces numerous challenges, including over-reliance on energy exports, corruption, and an aging population. Despite the growth during the early 2000s, the country's long-term economic outlook is uncertain. International sanctions, the declining oil market, and the increasing isolation of Russia from the global economy pose risks to its economic future. In recent years, Russia has been accused of engaging in cyber warfare and influence operations against other countries, particularly in the realm of election interference. The Russian government has denied these allegations, but the issue has become a major point of contention in international relations. Under Putin, there has been a resurgence of Soviet-era symbols and rhetoric. The Russian government has sought to revive national pride by emphasizing the Soviet victory in World War II and celebrating Soviet symbols. This has been part of an effort to strengthen Russian nationalism and consolidate support for the government. The future of Russia remains uncertain. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, coupled with domestic challenges and international isolation, poses significant risks. Russia's political landscape is heavily influenced by Putin's leadership, and questions remain about the country's direction after his rule. The legacy of the Soviet Union is complex and continues to influence Russia and the former Soviet republics. While the USSR's collapse marked the end of a superpower, its impact on global politics, economics, and culture remains significant. The rise of post-Soviet Russia under Putin has been marked by both challenges and successes, and the future of the region is still shaped by the shadows of its Soviet past.
After the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russia and the other former Soviet republics faced significant challenges. The transition from a centrally planned economy to a market economy was turbulent. Russia under Boris Yeltsin embarked on privatization and liberalization policies, which led to hyperinflation, massive unemployment, and the rise of oligarchs who controlled much of the economy. The 1990s were marked by political instability, widespread poverty, and a decline in Russia's global stature. Boris Yeltsin was the first president of Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. His presidency was marked by economic reforms, including the shock therapy measures aimed at transitioning the economy to capitalism. However, these reforms led to economic hardship for many Russians, with a sharp rise in inequality and a dramatic decline in living standards. The rise of oligarchs during this period further entrenched corruption, while Russia's political landscape became unstable. During the privatization process, a small group of businessmen known as oligarchs emerged, acquiring vast wealth and control over Russia's major industries, particularly in oil, gas, and banking. The oligarchs became deeply intertwined with the political system, with some using their wealth to influence political decisions. This created a system of crony capitalism that persists to this day. In 1998, Russia faced a major financial crisis due to a combination of falling oil prices, rising debt, and mismanagement. The Russian government defaulted on its debt, and the ruble collapsed, leading to severe inflation and a deep recession. The crisis significantly weakened the Yeltsin administration and highlighted the weaknesses in Russia's economic and financial systems. Vladimir Putin, who became prime minister in 1999 and later president in 2000, presented himself as a strong leader capable of restoring order and stability to Russia. His rise to power was initially seen as a way to move beyond the chaos of the Yeltsin years. Putin's early presidency focused on consolidating power, stabilizing the economy, and reasserting Russia's role in global politics. One of the defining events of Putin's early presidency was the Second Chechen War, which began in 1999. Russia's military launched an offensive to reclaim control over the breakaway Republic of Chechnya. The war was brutal, and widespread human rights abuses were reported. Despite heavy losses, the Russian government declared victory by 2009, and Chechnya was brought back under Russian control. In the early 2000s, Russia's economy began to recover, largely due to rising oil prices. This allowed Putin to rebuild Russia's foreign reserves, increase government spending, and improve living standards for many Russians. Economic growth during Putin's first 2 terms was robust, although the country's economic model remained heavily reliant on oil and gas exports, which made it vulnerable to global market fluctuations. Putin focused on centralizing power within the executive branch of government, weakening the influence of regional leaders and limiting political opposition. The media, which had previously been more independent during the Yeltsin years, was increasingly brought under state control. Opposition parties were marginalized, and civil society groups faced increasing pressure. This period saw the gradual erosion of democratic institutions and the rise of an increasingly authoritarian system. Putin pursued an assertive foreign policy aimed at restoring Russia's influence in global affairs. This included rebuilding ties with former Soviet republics, pursuing energy dominance, and opposing Western influence in the region. Russia's relations with NATO and the European Union became increasingly strained, particularly after the expansion of NATO to include former Soviet states in Eastern Europe. In 2008, Russia fought a brief war with Georgia over the separatist regions of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. The war was a direct response to Georgia's attempt to bring the regions back under central government control. Russia's intervention drew condemnation from the West, but solidified its influence in the Caucasus region. In 2014, Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine after a disputed referendum. This move was widely condemned by the international community, with the United States and the European Union imposing sanctions on Russia. The annexation led to a major deterioration in relations between Russia and the West and marked the beginning of the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine. The conflict in eastern Ukraine, which began in 2014, has been a major point of tension between Russia and the West. Russia has supported separatist rebels in the Donbass region, leading to a prolonged and bloody war. The conflict has resulted in thousands of deaths and displaced people, and it remains unresolved despite several attempts at peace negotiations. In response to Russia's actions in Ukraine and other international incidents, the United States and European Union imposed a series of economic sanctions on Russia. These sanctions targeted key sectors of the Russian economy, including energy, defense, and finance. While Russia has sought to mitigate the impact of sanctions by diversifying its economy and finding new trade partners, the sanctions have contributed to Russia's increasing isolation from the West. In 2016, Russian operatives were accused of interfering in the United States presidential election through hacking, propaganda, and disinformation campaigns. This alleged interference strained U.S.-Russia relations and led to investigations into Russia's role in undermining democratic processes in the West. While Russia denied involvement, the issue remains a major point of contention between the two countries. Under Putin, Russia has invested heavily in modernizing its military. This includes upgrading nuclear weapons, developing advanced missile systems, and strengthening the Russian armed forces. Russia's military actions in Ukraine, Syria, and other parts of the world demonstrate the country's commitment to projecting military power as part of its foreign policy strategy. Domestically, Putin has used a combination of state control over the media, legal measures, and political repression to maintain power. Political opposition figures have been imprisoned or killed, and protests have been met with crackdowns. Putin's popularity remains high among many Russians, but his rule has also been marked by widespread corruption, cronyism, and a lack of political freedoms. In recent years, Russia has strengthened its strategic partnership with China. This partnership has included cooperation in trade, energy, and military matters. Russia has increasingly sought to align itself with China in opposition to Western influence, and the two countries have developed a close political and economic relationship. Under Putin, Russian nationalism has become an important element of the government's ideological framework. Putin has sought to tap into the Russian public's sense of national pride, particularly by emphasizing Russia's historical greatness and positioning the country as a counterweight to the West. Nationalism has also been used to justify military actions in Ukraine and Syria, as well as domestic repression. Despite economic recovery in the early 2000s, Russia remains highly dependent on oil and gas exports. Fluctuations in global oil prices continue to have a major impact on Russia's economy, and the country's failure to diversify its economy has left it vulnerable to external shocks. Additionally, the country faces significant challenges in terms of corruption, an aging population, and economic inequality. Russia has become increasingly authoritarian under Putin, with the erosion of democratic institutions, political freedoms, and civil rights. Elections are often manipulated, opposition leaders are silenced, and media outlets that criticize the government are shut down or censored. The country's political system is dominated by Putin and his allies, leaving little room for opposition or dissent. Russia has sought to reassert its role as a global power, particularly in relation to the United States and Europe. Through military interventions, energy politics, and diplomatic efforts, Russia has aimed to challenge the Western-led international order. Russia's growing influence in the Middle East, particularly through its involvement in Syria, has further elevated its global standing. Putin's rule has had a profound impact on Russia's political, economic, and social landscape. While many Russians credit him with restoring stability after the chaos of the 1990s, his leadership has also been marked by repression, corruption, and growing authoritarianism. As he prepares for a longer tenure in power, the future of Russia remains uncertain. The future of Russia under Putin's leadership remains uncertain. Domestic challenges such as economic stagnation, political repression, and an aging population pose significant risks. Meanwhile, tensions with the West, military conflicts, and global isolation continue to define Russia's geopolitical trajectory. The nation's future depends on whether it can overcome its internal challenges and adapt to an ever-changing international landscape. The latter part of the 21st century sees Russia grappling with new challenges, including technological advancements, global environmental concerns, and shifting alliances. Russia's leadership, particularly under Putin, faces increasing pressure both domestically and internationally as it seeks to navigate the evolving geopolitical and economic landscape, balancing its desire for power with the constraints of internal and external factors. The 2010s saw a mix of economic stagnation and recovery for Russia. Despite early optimism fueled by high oil prices, the latter part of the decade was marked by economic challenges. Western sanctions, a sluggish global economy, and a decline in oil prices in the mid-2010s put a strain on Russia's finances. Moreover, Russia's failure to diversify its economy from its reliance on energy exports became more apparent as it continued to struggle with issues like corruption, inefficiency, and inadequate infrastructure development. By the 2010s, Putin's rule had evolved from one of managing a democratic transition to a deeply entrenched authoritarian regime. Key political opponents were silenced or marginalized, and independent media outlets were increasingly controlled or shut down. Elections were tightly managed, and opposition leaders like Alexei Navalny faced imprisonment or exile. The erosion of democratic processes and the centralization of power around the presidency became defining features of Russia's political landscape, sparking widespread criticism from Western governments and human rights organizations. The most significant geopolitical event of the 2010s was Russia's intervention in Ukraine, starting with the annexation of Crimea in 2014. The annexation was widely condemned as illegal by the international community, leading to severe economic sanctions from the US and European Union. Russia also supported separatist forces in eastern Ukraine, leading to a prolonged conflict in the Donbass region. By 2022, this conflict escalated into a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, further drawing Russia into a deep confrontation with the West and altering the balance of power in Eastern Europe. In response to its annexation of Crimea and its involvement in the conflict in Ukraine, Russia faced growing international isolation. Economic sanctions, trade restrictions, and diplomatic expulsions severely impacted Russia's economy and its global relations. Furthermore, Russia's alleged interference in foreign elections, particularly in the 2016 US presidential election, added to its international pariah status. The Russian government continued to use propaganda and disinformation campaigns to counteract Western criticism, exacerbating global divisions and tensions. Russia's military modernization became a focal point of Putin's policy in the 2010s and beyond. Under Putin, the Russian military has undergone significant upgrades, including the development of advanced weapon systems like hypersonic missiles and the expansion of nuclear capabilities. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, 2014 present, and the military involvement in Syria were part of Russia's broader strategy to assert itself as a global power and counterbalance Western influence. Russia's increased military activities have raised alarms in NATO and neighboring countries. Russia's relations with the European Union have fluctuated, particularly after the annexation of Crimea and the crisis in Ukraine. The EU imposed sanctions on Russia, targeting sectors like energy, finance, and defense. While Russia maintained strong economic ties with the EU, particularly in energy, the political relationship has been strained. Russia has often accused the EU of acting under the influence of the US, and the EU views Russia's actions in Ukraine, Syria, and internally as a threat to European security. In response to growing tensions with the West, Russia has increasingly turned to China for political, economic, and military cooperation. The relationship between the two countries has strengthened, with Russia supplying China with oil, gas, and military technology. The two nations have become closer in opposing Western dominance in global affairs, particularly through joint efforts in the United Nations and trade agreements. However, Russia's reliance on China as a strategic partner also exposes it to the risks of becoming increasingly subordinate to China's growing global influence. In February 2022, Russia launched a full-scale invasion of Ukraine, leading to a dramatic escalation in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. The invasion has drawn widespread condemnation from the international community. with the US, EU, and other Western countries imposing harsher sanctions on Russia. The conflict has led to a severe humanitarian crisis, with thousands of civilian casualties and millions displaced. The war has fundamentally reshaped the geopolitical landscape, challenging the post-Cold War order and putting global security at risk. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine prompted the West to impose sweeping economic sanctions on Russia, targeting key industries such as energy, finance, and defense. The Russian economy faced a sharp downturn, with the ruble depreciating, inflation rising, and foreign investment fleeing the country. However, Russia managed to pivot toward Asia, particularly China and India, as alternative trading partners. Despite these efforts, the sanctions have significantly hindered Russia's economic development, and the war has cost Russia both financially and diplomatically. The full-scale invasion of Ukraine prompted the West to impose sweeping economic sanctions on Russia, targeting key industries such as energy, finance, and defense. The Russian economy faced a sharp downturn, with the ruble depreciating, inflation rising, and foreign investment fleeing the country. However, Russia managed to pivot toward Asia, particularly China and India, as alternative trading partners. Despite these efforts, the sanctions have significantly hindered Russia's economic development, and the war has cost Russia both financially and diplomatically. In response to both internal and external challenges, the Russian government has further tightened its control over the media and information. Laws regulating the internet and restricting free speech have been enforced more strictly. Opposition voices have been silenced, and independent media outlets have been forced to shut down or flee the country. The state has utilized propaganda and state-controlled media to maintain support for the war and the government's actions, while limiting the flow of independent news and dissenting opinions. Russia's invasion of Ukraine has led to widespread condemnation from much of the international community. Many countries, particularly in Europe and North America, have provided significant military and humanitarian support to Ukraine. NATO and the EU have been instrumental in imposing sanctions on Russia, while countries like China and India have maintained a more neutral stance, though their growing ties with Russia complicate the international response. As the war in Ukraine continues and Russia faces increasing isolation, the future of the country under Putin's leadership remains uncertain. While Putin has consolidated power domestically, he faces the challenge of managing a deteriorating economy, rising public discontent, and international condemnation. His legacy will be defined by his handling of the Ukrainian conflict, his efforts to maintain Russia's global influence, and the long-term sustainability of the political system he has built. Despite the challenges it faces, Russia continues to play a significant role in global geopolitics. Its military power, energy resources, and political alliances give it leverage in regional and global affairs. However, its growing isolation from the West, coupled with the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, suggests that Russia may face a more constrained future on the world stage, particularly as international economic and political trends shift. As Russia enters the 2020s, the legacy of the Soviet Union remains a complex issue. While Russia continues to assert its power in a way reminiscent of the Soviet era, It has faced challenges in overcoming the deep scars left by the USSR's collapse. The Soviet experience, marked by repression, economic inefficiency, and international rivalry, shapes much of Russia's current political and economic realities. With tensions between Russia and the West reaching new heights due to the war in Ukraine, many analysts have described the current period as a new Cold War. While Russia's position on the global stage has weakened, it continues to challenge Western ideals of democracy and liberalism, particularly through its alliances with China and its increasing military capabilities. The new Cold War, however, is shaped by new technologies, cyber warfare, and economic sanctions. The future of Russia remains uncertain as it navigates a rapidly changing global order. With Putin's strong grip on power, Russia faces both internal challenges, such as economic stagnation and growing public discontent, and external challenges, including its increasing isolation from the West. How Russia adapts to these pressures and whether it can redefine its place in the world will be key factors in shaping its future. In 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine marked the beginning of what many have labeled as a new Cold War. The West's response, including severe economic sanctions, military aid to Ukraine, and diplomatic isolation, has created a sharp divide between Russia and NATO countries. This new Cold War is shaped not just by ideological opposition, but by economic warfare, cyber attacks, and military confrontations, with Russia vying to reassert itself as a global power. Nuclear weapons remain at the heart of Russia's defense and foreign policy. As a major nuclear power, Russia has emphasized its nuclear capabilities to project strength, particularly in the face of NATO and Western sanctions. The Russian government continues to modernize its nuclear arsenal, with President Putin using nuclear rhetoric as a tool for deterrence. However, Russia's reliance on nuclear deterrence has also raised concerns about global security and the potential for an arms race. The imposition of severe economic sanctions following Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had profound effects on the Russian economy. The sanctions targeted key industries such as energy, defense, and finance, leading to an economic slowdown, a drop in foreign investment, and high inflation. Russia has sought to mitigate these sanctions by turning to countries like China, India, and other non-Western nations for economic cooperation. But the long-term effects of the sanctions are still unfolding. In the aftermath of the 2022 invasion of Ukraine, Russia has seen further consolidation of power under President Vladimir Putin. Political opposition is increasingly marginalized, with many independent media outlets silenced or forced into exile. Protests against the war in Ukraine have been met with heavy repression, and many Russians who have voiced dissent have been arrested or persecuted. Russia's political system is now characterized by a lack of free press, suppressed opposition, and a concentration of power in the Kremlin. Civil society in Russia has been severely constrained under Putin's rule. Laws restricting free speech, assembly, and protest have led to a climate of fear among activists and citizens who seek to challenge the government. The government has passed laws that criminalize fake news and foreign influence, leading to greater censorship and control over information. International human rights organizations have consistently reported violations of civil rights in Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church has gained significant influence in Russian society, particularly under Putin's rule. The Church has become a key supporter of the state, and its leaders often align with Putin's policies. The Church's endorsement of traditional Russian values has helped reinforce Putin's agenda, particularly his focus on nationalism and anti-Western rhetoric. However, the increasing influence of the Church has also led to concerns about the separation of church and state in Russia. Once hailed as a potential democracy after the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia has increasingly shifted toward autocratic governance under Putin. The 1990s, under Boris Yeltsin, saw the emergence of democratic institutions, but these were eroded during the 2000s and 2010s as Putin centralized power. Key reforms have limited political opposition, and state-controlled media ensures that the government maintains its narrative. The shrinking of political freedoms and suppression of dissenting views have led many analysts to label Russia's political system as a hybrid regime, somewhere between authoritarianism and democracy. Russia's foreign policy has been marked by a desire to reassert its power on the global stage. The annexation of Crimea and its support for separatist movements in eastern Ukraine are examples of Russia's broader strategy to protect its sphere of influence, particularly in former Soviet republics. Russia's military involvement in Syria, its alliance with China, and its efforts to challenge all demonstrate its ambition to be a counterbalance to Western power. Despite its increasing isolation from the West, Russia continues to play a significant role in global affairs, often in opposition to US and European policies. Energy exports have been a key pillar of Russia's economy, particularly in its relationship with Europe. However, after the invasion of Ukraine, many European countries began to reduce their reliance on Russian energy, further isolating the Russian economy. The European Union has worked to diversify its energy sources, and while Russia has turned to China and other countries for energy trade, it faces challenges in replacing its lost European market. The loss of this market, combined with sanctions, has forced Russia to reconsider its energy strategies. Russia's involvement in the Middle East has grown significantly since the early 2000s, especially through its military intervention in Syria in 2015. Russia has strengthened ties with countries like Iran and Turkey, and has increased its influence in the region. The Russian military presence in Syria has allowed Russia to project power in the Middle East, creating new geopolitical dynamics and challenging US and Western influence in the region. The relationship between Russia and China has deepened significantly, especially as both countries face growing isolation from the West. They have cooperated on military, economic, and geopolitical matters, with Russia supplying China with energy resources and military technology. China has emerged as a key partner for Russia, particularly as the West imposes sanctions in response to the war in Ukraine. However, Russia's increasing dependence on China raises concerns about Russia becoming subordinate to China's global ambitions. Russia's global influence, once based on its superpower status during the Soviet era, has significantly declined in recent decades. While the country maintains a powerful military and significant natural resources, its soft power, The ability to attract and influence through culture, diplomacy, and values has eroded. Russia's image abroad has been severely damaged by its actions in Ukraine, its suppression of dissent, and its disregard for international norms. Russia's demographic challenges are another pressing issue. The country has one of the lowest birth rates in the world and a rapidly aging population. This demographic shift poses a major problem for the Russian economy, particularly as the workforce shrinks and the burden of supporting the elderly grows. Immigration has been one of the few ways to offset the decline. But the country faces difficulties in attracting the necessary skilled labor. Despite economic challenges and diplomatic isolation, Russia remains a military superpower. The country's vast nuclear arsenal and modernized conventional forces make it a formidable adversary on the world stage. Russia's military capabilities are a central part of its global influence, and the military plays a key role in Putin's strategies for asserting Russian power in regions like Ukraine, Syria, and Eastern Europe. Russia's political system is increasingly characterized by authoritarianism, with power concentrated in the hands of President Putin and his close allies. The future of Russia's political system remains uncertain as it continues to face internal and external challenges. The prospects for political reform seem slim, as Putin's government has used various methods, including legal and extrajudicial measures, to maintain its grip on power. It remains unclear how long this system can endure, especially with mounting economic pressures and growing discontent within the population. Russia's actions in Ukraine and its increasing authoritarianism have led to a deep rift with the West. Relations between Russia and NATO, as well as the US and European Union, have been significantly damaged, and the future of any diplomatic resolution remains uncertain. The global order is shifting, and Russia is positioning itself in opposition to Western ideals, particularly regarding democracy, human rights, and international norms. Vladimir Putin's legacy is deeply tied to Russia's resurgence as a global power and its increasing authoritarianism. His policies have shaped modern Russia, restoring national pride while suppressing political opposition and stifling democratic progress. How Russia's future unfolds after his tenure will determine the lasting impact of his rule. Vladimir Putin's legacy is deeply tied to Russia's resurgence as a global power and its increasing authoritarianism. His policies have shaped modern Russia, restoring national pride while suppressing political opposition and stifling democratic progress. How Russia's future unfolds after his tenure will determine the lasting impact of his rule. Russia stands at a crossroads in the 21st century. While its military strength and energy resources continue to provide leverage, its political, economic, and demographic challenges are significant. As it faces increasing isolation and rising internal dissent, the future of Russia remains uncertain. The country's ability to adapt to a changing global order, manage its resources effectively, and address its internal problems will be key to determining its place in the world moving forward. Russia's journey into the 21st century has been one of transition, conflict, and adaptation. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, Russia has navigated through a turbulent period marked by economic upheaval, the consolidation of authoritarian power, and an ongoing struggle for its place on the global stage. Under Vladimir Putin's leadership, Russia has pursued an increasingly assertive foreign policy, sought to rebuild its global influence, and used its energy resources as both a diplomatic tool and an economic lifeline. While Russia initially appeared to be on a path toward a more democratic system in the 1990s, the political environment has become progressively more repressive, particularly as Putin's grip on power tightened. The suppression of political opposition, media control, and growing authoritarianism have led many to question Russia's future as a truly democratic state. Instead, the country has evolved into a highly centralized system in which power is concentrated in the hands of a few individuals. As Russia faces mounting internal and external challenges, its future remains uncertain. Russia's efforts to assert itself as a global power have been particularly evident in its relations with the West. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, the ongoing conflict in eastern Ukraine, and the invasion of Ukraine in 2022 have strained relations between Russia and the West, leading to severe sanctions, economic isolation, and a breakdown of diplomatic channels. The geopolitical landscape has shifted, with Russia finding itself in opposition to the United States and NATO, while simultaneously seeking closer ties with China and other non-Western countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 marked the end of an era in global geopolitics. The USSR had been a superpower that competed with the United States for ideological and military supremacy. The Soviet Union's collapse led to the creation of 15 independent republics, including the Russian Federation, which inherited much of the Soviet legacy. Despite the dissolution of the Soviet system, many aspects of its governance and policies remain ingrained in Russia's political culture. The Soviet Union's legacy can still be seen in Russia's centralization of power, its reliance on state-controlled media, and its heavy emphasis on national security. The central planning mentality that dominated the Soviet economy has been replaced by a more market-driven approach. But Russia remains overly dependent on oil and gas exports, much as it did under the USSR. Despite the shift to a market economy in the post-Soviet era, the absence of genuine political pluralism and the persistence of authoritarianism in Russian politics can be traced directly to the Soviet legacy. Under Putin, Russia has worked to reassert its power on the global stage. The annexation of Crimea, the military intervention in Syria, and Russia's involvement in global security issues have all been part of this strategy. Russia has sought to challenge the Western-led world order and create a multipolar world where it can play a central role. Putin's leadership has been marked by a return to strong state control over both the economy and political institutions. Domestically, Putin has focused on stabilizing the Russian economy, rebuilding military strength, and promoting a narrative of Russian nationalism. This nationalism has been central to Putin's ability to maintain popular support, with the government using historical events such as World War II victories and Soviet-era pride as part of its propaganda efforts. Internationally, Russia has positioned itself as a counterbalance to the United States and NATO, emphasizing its role as a protector of traditional values in opposition to Western liberalism. Despite the hope for political reform in the 1990s, Russia has seen a steady decline in democratic freedoms. Under Putin's rule, Russia has seen an erosion of political pluralism, with opposition parties, civil society organizations, and independent media outlets being either silenced or co-opted by the state. Political dissent is increasingly punished, and the Russian government has been accused of rigging elections to maintain control. The suppression of free speech, the militarization of politics, and the lack of meaningful political opposition suggest that Russia is unlikely to return to a fully democratic system in the near future. While Putin has maintained strong public approval, the lack of political freedom and the concentration of power in the hands of the executive branch have made it difficult for meaningful democratic reforms to take root. Russia's political system is now characterized by authoritarianism, with power largely remaining within the Kremlin and a small elite. This raises significant concerns about Russia's long-term political stability, particularly as younger generations express dissatisfaction with the lack of political and economic opportunities. Russia's economic structure is heavily reliant on the extraction and export of natural resources, particularly oil and gas. The country's vast energy reserves provide significant revenue, but they also make the economy vulnerable to fluctuations in global energy prices. Despite efforts to diversify its economy, particularly in technology and manufacturing, Russia's over-reliance on energy exports remains a major vulnerability. The global push for clean energy and the ongoing geopolitical tensions with the West have exacerbated Russia's economic challenges. Sanctions targeting Russia's energy sector, as well as the increasing shift to renewable energy, have put further pressure on the Russian economy. In the 2020s, Russia faces the dual challenge of diversifying its economic base while maintaining its position as a global energy power. How Russia adapts to these challenges will be a key factor in its long-term economic survival. Russia's role in the global order has changed dramatically since the end of the Cold War. Once a superpower in direct competition with the United States, Russia now faces a multipolar world where it must compete with China, India, and other emerging powers. Russia's efforts to reassert itself as a global power have been marked by military interventions, energy politics, and cyber warfare. Despite its military might and strategic position, Russia is increasingly isolated from the West and faces growing challenges in maintaining its global influence. As tensions with NATO and the European Union rise, Russia has turned toward China and other non-Western nations for strategic partnerships. While these partnerships offer some relief, they come with their own set of challenges. China's growing influence in Central Asia and its dominance in global trade have made Russia's role in the region less dominant than it once was. Nevertheless, Russia continues to pursue policies aimed at expanding its global footprint, using military, economic, and diplomatic tools to assert its position. Russian nationalism has become a cornerstone of Putin's political strategy, appealing to both the country's pride in its Soviet past and its desire to reclaim its position as a global power. Nationalism has been used to justify military actions in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea, framing these actions as a defense of Russian-speaking populations and historic Russian territories. While nationalism has helped Putin maintain domestic support, it has also contributed to Russia's growing isolation from the West. The rise of nationalism has also led to the suppression of minority rights and the marginalization of dissenting voices within Russia. The government's rhetoric about defending traditional values and resisting Western liberalism has fueled xenophobia, anti-Western sentiment, and political repression. As Russia becomes more inward-looking and nationalistic, its relations with neighboring countries and the global community become more strained. The future of Russia is uncertain. While the country remains a global power with a significant military and energy resources, it faces internal challenges that could affect its stability. The growing political repression, economic stagnation, and demographic decline present significant risks to Russia's long-term viability. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine, combined with rising tensions with the West, has placed Russia on a collision course with global norms and institutions. For Russia to secure a stable future, it will need to address its political and economic challenges. This includes diversifying its economy, implementing political reforms, and finding a way to coexist with the West and other global powers. The future of Russia depends on whether it can evolve from its authoritarian past and adapt to the changing geopolitical and economic realities of the 21st century. The future of Russia remains uncertain as it continues to grapple with both internal and external challenges. Over the past few decades, Russia's trajectory has been shaped by its leadership under Vladimir Putin. But as the country moves forward, several factors will influence its path. These include Russia's political structure, its economic sustainability, its role in the global order, and the internal pressures that are building from its changing demographics and the increasing isolation from the West. As Russia moves further into the 21st century, its political evolution will be shaped by numerous factors, including its centralized leadership, the legacy of Soviet governance, and the increasing challenges posed by economic stagnation, public dissatisfaction, and a growing desire for change. While Vladimir Putin has maintained a strong grip on power through a mix of populism, nationalism, and a controlled political system, the sustainability of his authoritarian model remains uncertain. Russia's political system, characterized by a lack of political pluralism and increasing authoritarianism, faces growing internal challenges. A rising tide of discontent, particularly among the younger population, demands a broader political discourse and genuine electoral competition. However, the entrenched political elite, the security services, and Putin's loyalists continue to wield significant influence, making political reforms or shifts toward democracy unlikely in the short term. Despite growing pressure, Putin's regime has thus far avoided major internal revolts or challenges. However, as Russia grapples with economic difficulties and international isolation, the ability of the Kremlin to maintain its monopoly on power will be tested. The future of Russian democracy, if it emerges at all, could depend on a generational shift in leadership and the ability of new political actors to gain ground within an increasingly restricted political space. The future of Russia's economy depends heavily on its ability to diversify beyond its reliance on oil and gas exports. Despite having vast natural resources, Russia's economy remains vulnerable to fluctuations in global energy prices, which significantly impact the country's revenue streams. With the world increasingly transitioning toward renewable energy sources and decarbonization efforts gathering momentum, Russia must consider how to develop its non-energy sectors to reduce economic vulnerability. While there have been attempts at diversification, such as developing high-tech industries and creating a stronger digital economy, the results have been mixed. The Russian government has invested in infrastructure projects and innovation hubs, but inefficiencies in governance, corruption, and the lack of meaningful reform in the financial and legal sectors have hampered significant progress. Russia's dependence on energy exports not only exposes it to external pressures, but also stifles internal innovation. The need to develop more sustainable industries, diversify trade partnerships, and stimulate entrepreneurship is evident. However, in a context of ongoing sanctions and economic isolation, achieving true economic diversification will be a difficult, long-term challenge. Furthermore, the widespread corruption that pervades Russia's political and business sectors complicates any attempts at meaningful reform. In the future, Russia's ability to compete in a technologically advanced world will be pivotal to its economic survival. However, the country faces several obstacles in this area. Despite having a strong scientific and technological base inherited from the Soviet era, Russia has fallen behind in crucial industries such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and green technology. Global competition for technological dominance is intense, and Russia risks being left behind unless it invests heavily in modernizing its infrastructure, research and development, and education systems. The Russian government has recognized the need to boost the tech sector, and initiatives have been launched to develop domestic high-tech industries. Yet, these efforts have not led to significant breakthroughs or widespread innovation. The brain drain is another critical issue. Many of Russia's brightest minds have left the country for better opportunities abroad, further hindering the potential for technological advancement. In the coming years, Russia will need to prioritize investments in education, research, and innovation. It will also need to foster a more competitive and transparent business environment to attract both domestic and international investors. Without a significant shift in these areas, Russia may struggle to maintain its position in the global economy. Russia's demographic challenges are among the most pressing issues facing the country today. The nation's population has been steadily declining for decades due to low birth rates, high mortality rates, and a shrinking workforce. The aging population places immense pressure on the pension system, health care, and social services. Russia faces a major challenge in sustaining economic growth with a shrinking labor force and increasing social welfare demands. In response to these challenges, the Russian government has introduced policies aimed at increasing the birth rate, such as providing financial incentives for families with children. However, these measures have not been sufficient to reverse the population decline. Additionally, the outflow of young, educated professionals seeking better opportunities abroad has exacerbated the demographic crisis. To address these issues, Russia will need to embrace policies that encourage higher birth rates, promote immigration, and improve healthcare outcomes. Moreover, fostering a climate of opportunity for young Russians within the country could help stem the tide of emigration and ensure a sustainable future workforce. Russia's military plays a significant role in the country's global strategy, and it will continue to be a central part of its foreign policy in the coming years. Russia's military capabilities, including its nuclear arsenal, are among the most powerful in the world, and the country has shown a willingness to use its military force to assert its interests in regions like Ukraine and Syria. The military will continue to be a key tool for Russia in asserting its influence abroad. As the country faces increasing isolation and tensions with the West, the Russian government will likely rely on military power to project strength and challenge Western policies. Russia's military interventions in Ukraine, Syria, and other regions demonstrate its willingness to use force to secure its geopolitical interests. However, the cost of maintaining such a powerful military, combined with economic sanctions and the strain on domestic resources, presents a significant challenge for Russia. While the military remains an essential aspect of Russia's global posture, its long-term sustainability could be jeopardized by domestic economic challenges. The military will continue to be a key tool for Russia in asserting its influence abroad. As the country faces increasing isolation and tensions with the West, the Russian government will likely rely on military power to project strength and challenge Western policies. Russia's military interventions in Ukraine, Syria, and other regions demonstrate its willingness to use force to secure its geopolitical interests. However, the cost of maintaining such a powerful military, combined with economic sanctions and the strain on domestic resources, presents a significant challenge for Russia. While the military remains an essential aspect of Russia's global posture, its long-term sustainability could be jeopardized by domestic economic challenges. Russia's global alliances will continue to evolve, particularly as its relationship with the West becomes increasingly strained. While Russia has increasingly aligned itself with China and other non-Western powers, its global influence is limited by its economic struggles and political isolation. The strategic partnership with China, particularly in energy and military matters, will remain critical for Russia. But it also comes with risks, as Russia could become more dependent on China in the future. Russia's efforts to maintain influence in former Soviet republics, particularly in Central Asia and Eastern Europe, will continue. However, many of these countries have sought closer ties with the European Union and NATO, leaving Russia's regional influence increasingly contested. Russia will likely continue to use energy resources, military intervention, and diplomatic leverage to maintain its sphere of influence. In the coming years, Russia's role on the global stage will likely be shaped by its ability to balance its alliances with China and other emerging powers, while navigating increasing isolation from the West. Russia will need to adapt to the changing global order if it hopes to maintain its relevance and influence. Nationalism will remain a powerful force in Russian politics in the coming years. Putin's government has used nationalism as a key tool to consolidate power, frame foreign policy, and suppress opposition. The narrative of Russian exceptionalism and the defense of traditional values against the West has resonated with many Russians, particularly in times of external conflict. However, the future of Russian nationalism may face internal challenges. As economic pressures mount, political freedoms are restricted, and public dissatisfaction grows. The government's reliance on nationalism as a tool of unity may begin to falter. The ability of the government to maintain this narrative will depend on the extent to which the Russian public feels that their interests are being represented. In a changing geopolitical landscape, the question of how long nationalism will sustain the regime and Russian unity is crucial. Russia's future will also be shaped by its younger generation. The millennials and Generation Z in Russia are more connected to the global community than ever before, and many are critical of the political system. While there is still significant support for Putin among older generations, younger Russians are more likely to demand political reforms, greater freedoms, and opportunities to succeed within the country. The government's ability to respond to the desires of younger generations who seek better economic opportunities, greater political freedoms, and a modernized, diversified economy will be crucial for Russia's long-term stability. If the Russian state fails to address these demands, it could face rising social unrest, or even the eventual emergence of new political movements that challenge the current political order. The path ahead for Russia is uncertain. The country is at a crossroads, with internal challenges related to its political system, economy, demographics, and international relationships. Russia's ability to address these challenges will determine its future role in the global order. The growing strain between Russia and the West, combined with internal pressures, could push Russia into greater isolation or force the country to reconsider its approach to governance, foreign policy, and economic development. Russia's political landscape in the 21st century is shaped by the legacy of the Soviet system, the influence of Vladimir Putin, and the evolving demands of its citizens. The centralization of power under Putin has led to a system characterized by a mix of nationalism, authoritarianism, and strategic international positioning. While Putin's grip on power appears unchallenged, there are growing signs of political instability. The Russian electorate, while still supportive of the government's key policies, is increasingly dissatisfied with the lack of political freedoms, corruption, and economic stagnation. In the future, Russia's political trajectory will likely be influenced by generational shifts, domestic economic challenges, and the struggle between the government and emerging opposition movements. Whether Russia continues its authoritarian trajectory or undergoes some form of political reform will depend on the demands of an increasingly younger and more globalized population. The growing divide between the political elite and ordinary Russians could trigger a movement for greater democracy or spark wider civil unrest. Russia's economy remains heavily dependent on energy exports, particularly oil and gas. This dependence makes the country vulnerable to fluctuations in global oil prices, which in turn affect the broader economic stability of the nation. The push for renewable energy globally has compounded this vulnerability. Russia's failure to diversify its economy has made it highly susceptible to the risks posed by the global energy transition. While there have been attempts to modernize the Russian economy, including investments in high-tech industries, the results have been limited. The government has also attempted to promote innovation and entrepreneurship, but systemic corruption, a lack of transparency, and the dominance of state-run companies hinder meaningful economic diversification. Russia has remained a resource-based economy with limited progress in sectors such as technology, manufacturing, and services. The future of Russia's economy hinges on its ability to adapt to the global shift toward clean energy, as well as to foster a more diversified economy. This challenge is further complicated by external sanctions, which have limited Russia's access to international markets and technologies. To thrive in the coming decades, Russia must find ways to reduce its economic dependency on oil and gas, invest in new industries, and create a more dynamic economic environment. Since Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014 and its continued involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine, the country has faced increasing sanctions from the United States, the European Union, and other Western nations. These sanctions have targeted key sectors of Russia's economy, including its banking, defense, and energy industries. While Russia has managed to weather some of the effects of these sanctions by turning to countries like China and India, the broader impact has been significant. The sanctions have led to a decline in foreign investment, hindered technological development, and made it more difficult for Russia to modernize its economy. The international isolation caused by these sanctions, combined with internal economic challenges, has created a strained environment for Russia. It now faces the difficult task of navigating the global economic system while maintaining a degree of sovereignty over its domestic policies. The country's political elite has worked to build alternative economic relationships with non-Western nations. But this shift has not been sufficient to offset the economic challenges created by its ongoing isolation from the West. The future of Russia's global standing will depend largely on its ability to navigate this international isolation. If the sanctions persist or expand, Russia will face mounting economic difficulties. However, Russia's vast resources, particularly in energy, and its strategic military power, give it leverage in global geopolitics, especially with nations that seek to counterbalance US and European influence. Nationalism has been a central element of Russian politics, particularly under Putin's leadership. Putin has used nationalism as a tool to unite the population, galvanize support for the government, and justify Russia's foreign policy actions. The government has promoted the idea of Russian exceptionalism, which emphasizes the country's historical role as a global power and protector of traditional values. In the future, Russia's military will continue to play a central role in its global strategy. However, the cost of maintaining such a large and advanced military could strain Russia's economy, particularly in light of the ongoing economic challenges and sanctions. The balance between military power and economic sustainability will be crucial to Russia's ability to maintain its global influence. Nationalism has been particularly important in justifying Russia's actions in Ukraine. including the annexation of Crimea and its involvement in the conflict in eastern Ukraine. The Kremlin has framed these actions as part of a broader defense of Russian-speaking populations and historical Russian territories, which resonates with many Russians who view the Soviet collapse as a loss of Russian power and influence. Putin has used this sense of historical grievance to bolster his support among domestic audiences. However, nationalism also has the potential to divide the country and create internal tensions. As Russia becomes more inward-looking and nationalistic, it faces the risk of alienating ethnic minorities and opposition groups who may not share the same vision of a resurgent Russian identity. The challenge for Russia in the coming decades will be balancing nationalist pride with the need for internal unity and political stability. One of Russia's most pressing challenges is its demographic crisis. The country has one of the lowest birth rates in the world, and its population is aging rapidly. The economic impact of this demographic decline is significant, as a shrinking working-age population means fewer contributors to the economy and greater demands on the pension and healthcare systems. The aging population also poses a challenge for maintaining the labor force, particularly in the face of Russia's already existing economic stagnation. The government has attempted to address this issue by offering financial incentives to families with children, but these efforts have had limited success. Additionally, Russia's population decline has been exacerbated by high mortality rates, particularly among men, and a growing trend of emigration, particularly among young professionals seeking better opportunities abroad. To address the demographic crisis, Russia will need to invest in policies that promote family growth, healthcare reform, and immigration. Attracting skilled labor from abroad and improving conditions for young Russians to build their futures within the country will be essential to reversing the demographic decline. Without significant action on these fronts, Russia's population will continue to shrink, further compounding the country's economic and social challenges. Russia's nuclear weapons remain a crucial component of its defense strategy. Putin has used nuclear rhetoric as a tool to deter Western intervention in conflicts like the one in Ukraine and to strengthen Russia's position on the global stage. Russia's nuclear capabilities also provide it with leverage in global security discussions, where the country is often seen as a rival to the United States and NATO.